back to my channel for another top 10 video. I love doing these and I've been trying to update a lot of my top 10 genre videos over the past year, from sci-fi to romance to horror. I can link them all down below in a playlist in case that interests you. But one that I haven't done yet, and I don't think I've ever done in the history of my channel, although I have done related videos, is a top 10 self-published books video. So naturally, because this is all about a format of publishing rather than one genre, there's a breadth of different things covered here, but I actually think it's all the more important to film this video because when you're published traditionally, you have an entire publishing house behind you and people with expertise in marketing, etc. Whereas for self-published authors, there's more expectation that you rely on word of mouth and recommendations. So because I love all of these books in this video so much, I wanted to recommend them to you in one place, and they might then be books that you want to check out. I have, like I said, a few different genres covered here. I have fantasy, I have romance, I have historical fiction, contemporary fiction, Greek myth retellings. I think that covers all the sort of main genres, but you'll see as we go along. Some of these books are from authors who exclusively self-publish, whereas others are by authors who publish both themselves and through traditional publishing houses, because there is space for both to coexist, and different types of books can work really well in different contexts and different markets and different demographics that read more self-published or more traditionally published books. And I think it's really important never to overlook one over the other, because there are some gems out there. So without further ado, let's get into my top 10 self-published books. So these are in no particular order, but I'm sure a few of you heard bells in your ears when you heard me mention that there was a Greek myth retelling in here. So I'm gonna start with that one, which is Hear the World Entire by Anwen Hayward. So this is one of the very few retellings of the Greek and Roman myth of Medusa that I have come across. It's a myth that does not seem to be as popular for dedicated retellings, and when Medusa does appear in other contemporary versions of Greek myths, whether it be like Percy Jackson or Clash of the Titans, she remains this villainous monster and we never get to learn her backstory. But we do in Hear the World Entire. Hear the World Entire takes the original myth, which some of you may not be familiar with. If you'd like a lowdown breakdown of the entire myth and its history, I have a whole podcast episode on it that I'll link down below. But if you want like a straight up retelling that can help you feel some of the emotional turmoil of the story, then definitely check out Anwen's book. In case you aren't familiar, Medusa was actually a mortal woman in various versions of the myth who was sexually assaulted by the god Poseidon and then punished by the goddess Athena for having been assaulted in Athena's temple. I know, ultimate victim blaming, and turned into this gorgon before then proceeding with the rest of the story. And if you don't know the story, I also don't want to give it all away here in case you want to be surprised by the narrative in the book. But Anwen's book is beautiful. It takes place post-curse, in which Medusa is now a gorgon, but we hear about the trauma that she has experienced from the gods and from mortals, and it is so stunning, it's so emotive, and it very much touches on very contemporary modern themes or timeless themes of trauma, and it's very relatable despite it being a Greek myth. So I would highly recommend checking that one out. Next up, we have a historical murder mystery / romance. Yes, a lot is packed into this one book, and that is Proper English by KJ Charles. So this has very Agatha Christie vibes for me as a reader. It is set in the early 20th century and follows a young woman who is going off with her brother and some of their other friends to stay in this manor house for the weekend, hunting and playing cards and doing whatever people in that era did. It's a house party of the early 1900s, you know. Whilst there, our protagonist meets a young woman who she is inexplicably drawn to. I mean, maybe not inexplicably, it's pretty clear why she's drawn to her. And they end up starting up a relationship in secret at this manor house, but they are not the only people with secrets at this manor house. Everybody here has a secret, and all of those secrets are going to come into play as the book unfolds and mysteries are presented to the reader. I don't want to give away what happens, but trust me, what you will get in this book is Agatha Christie meets queer romance, and let's be honest, that is like peak collaboration right there. It is absolutely fantastic, really compelling, such fantastic characters, and quite funny as well. So next up is an author who I mention quite regularly, especially when I'm talking about fantasy or romance, because I absolutely adore all of her books, but the one I want to talk about today is The Faceless Woman by Emma Hamm. Now I talk about this one a little bit less frequently because technically it is the third in a series. But if I'm going to be honest and tell you my absolute top 10 favourite self-published books, then this is my favourite book by Emma Hamm, and it's my favourite book in this series, although I love the series all round. And I do think there is room to read this without having read the previous two books, or reading this then following them up with the previous two books, or of course just reading the first two books and then eventually getting to the third, which you will just know before going into it is my favourite. So what is this book about? It is in a series of fairy tale retellings set in the world of the Fae, and the first two books are a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, which follow a healer woman and a Fae prince from the Seelie court, whereas in books 3 and 4, beginning with The Faceless Woman, we follow a young witch and a fairy prince from the Unseelie court. And yes, they are coexisting in the same world as the first two books, but they are very much their own story and their own characters. So like I said, you can read them by themselves, but to be honest, the previous two books are great too, so like I'm not necessarily telling you to read them out of order. I just want to focus on the one that's my favourite because I love the dark, broody, witty, banter, flirting romance that is in book 3. I don't think I articulated that very well, but it's so very much a feeling rather than something you can articulate, and I just adore both the characters. They just have the best repartee. The story is actually a retelling of the Swan Princess, which is another one I don't actually read a lot of retellings of, so it was really nice to read in this format, and I think that Emma Hamm did a really great job of it. She brings the fairy world to life. It's so intricate, and particularly in book 3 and its sequel book 4, which follow this same couple, it's quite dark, in large part because it interacts with the Unseelie court of the Fae, and I love that about that. I love that dark, dangerous setting with our two heroes who are forced to go on an adventure together because they are very much forced to be together by a spell, and end up having fantastic chemistry and falling in love with each other. Like, what more could you want? If you do like your romance a little bit more contemporary, however, I do have a novella to recommend to you, and that is Mangoes and Mistletoe by Adrian Herrera. This is another one that takes us back to the FF queer romance subgenre, and it's one of my favourites. We all know I love an FF queer romance, and it's something that I often find myself reading in self-published over traditionally published books. I struggle far more to find it in the traditional publishing catalogue than I do in the self-publishing world. So if that's something that you like as well, it's a great resource for that. Now this one is effectively Great British Bake Off meets FF romance set in Scotland. We have two contestants who are putting a team together because one of them is a professional cook and one of them is an amateur, and they've been entered into this contest to be paired up randomly and compete against other duos in order to win the big grand prize at the end. And both women have very different plans for their future and very different intentions for what they're going to do once they win this prize. They also have very different styles of cooking and pastry making and cake baking, and they have to find that balance between themselves, and it's a balance that they also have to strike between themselves and their culture, because both have ties to the Dominican Republic. One has grown up there all her life, whereas the other is second generation living in the USA, and each has a different relationship with their culture, but they also have to balance that in their cooking when they are planning together. And it's this really wonderful story about two people just sort of bringing out the best in each other and finding a pathway that works for both of them whilst developing feelings for each other, and it's super cute, super sweet, and just super lovely, all pretty much synonyms for one another, but what can you do? Now, if you like your romance to both be contemporary and include fantasy and include a mystery, so basically everything we've mentioned so far, then you should check out Black Witch Magic. This one's by Mila Nix, and it's the first in the Paranormal Hunters series. So in this book we follow a male and female protagonist, both from very different walks of life. One is a young witch living in a town which she was cursed to never to be able to leave. Well, her family line of witches was cursed to never leave there. Celine has lived there her entire life with her best friend, having no option but to do so. But everything changes when Aiden arrives in town. So Aiden is a paranormal investigator. He and his best friend run a paranormal investigation web series that is incredibly popular, and he's the skeptic. So his best friend's the one that believes in the paranormal, he doesn't, and that's what makes them work as a duo on the TV or on the screen. And he ends up running into Celine, who is of course a witch. So we have the skeptic and the witch, and yeah, the chemistry. They have so much chemistry, I love it. But in the background of this there is a bit of a mystery, and the question is whether it's a paranormal one and who's behind it and what exactly is going on. And both Celine and Aidan end up tied up in solving it, which is a lot of fun. So you've got a lot of different elements there. Plus I have to say that this one did a fantastic job of throwing some really outdated romance tropes out the window and exploring a new relationship in a really honest and different way from I find in a lot of other romance. Not everything was perfect, and it was really nice to see them build up that chemistry and get to know one another better. I really, really enjoyed it. Next up is actually short story collection, so a little bit different again, and that is No Man of Women Born by Anna Mardell. So like I said, this is a short story collection. They are fantasy short stories, and they are all short stories which explore gender and different gender identities. Leanne, if you're watching this, thank you for disrupting my flow of thought there with your text messages. Back to the topic at hand. So we have a fantastical short story collection exploring gender, and it takes its inspiration from the quote or the trope that I think is best described by the Macbeth play, which is that the curse cannot be broken or the prophecy cannot be fulfilled by anyone other than no man of women born. And if you've read or seen Macbeth, you know that in that instance in particular it is solved by a quirk of birth rather than anything particular about the man himself, whereas Anna Mardell propositions that we think about this trope differently in fantasy and think about how fantasy could make better use of the whole spectrum of gender identity amongst humans to explore this tropes. So we have stories about trans characters, we have stories about non-binary characters, we have stories about gender fluid characters, and it is so well done, it is so clever. I kind of wish that every story in this book had its own entire novel, because I thought that each world and each character was so well done and so unique that they could have occupied my mind for a much longer period of time, but at the same time I really enjoyed the collection as a whole, and I think it's a really, really fantastic piece of LGBTQ plus fantasy and just fantasy in general, so I would highly recommend that you go and check it out. Next up we have For Tuna Sworn by KJ Sutton, which is the first in a contemporary urban fantasy series. So this is a really interesting one because I am not someone who gravitates towards urban fantasy, but this book does such a good job of balancing sort of 50% urban fantasy and 50% like world of the fae fantasy world fantasy, that it's really great for readers like me who don't tend to read urban fantasy, because I have that element of the world of the fae for massive swathes of the book. So if you're like me and love high fantasy, fae fantasy, then check this out. If you've not read much urban fantasy, check this out. If you love urban fantasy, check this out, because I think it might just like straddle all the fantasy subgenres and in that way be perfect for all readers, because it's fantastic. Like I said, it's the first in a series. I've read books 1 and 2 and have book 3 waiting for me on my Kindle. So excited to see what's next, because oh my goodness, is this one full of slow burn romances, and I'm so invested. But there's a lot of layers to the story as well. It's not just a romance, it's also a story about family, it's a story about the darker sides of life, about sort of just getting through life, about power and independence, and I absolutely love the character of For Tuna Sworn. She's a young woman but not a mortal woman. She's actually a nightmare, which is a type of magical creature which can, in touching you, feel your greatest fear and make that feel alive for you, and she's one of the last of her kind. Her and her brother are the only two nightmares that she still knows of as alive, and she's not even sure that her brother is still alive because he's been missing for a long time and she's been searching for him, until the day that a fae prince turns up on her doorstep and is like, well, I know where your brother is and I'll tell you if you marry me. And thus we have the beginning of For Tuna Sworn. But even that doesn't really do it justice, because there's so many more subplots and complexities to it. It's such an incredibly well imagined book. It's one of those books that you read and think to yourself, like, I can see how you got this plot, but like, how did you also think to add this? Because wow, those combine so well. And like I said, I cannot wait to read book 3. If you've ever heard me talk about fantasy romance in the past, however, then you've heard me talk about Grace Draven's books, because I am a die-hard fan. This is one of those authors who both traditionally publishes and self-publishes, but my absolutely favourite book by this author is Radiant, and it's one of her self-published works. This book was in my top 10 favourite books of all time. It was in my top 10 favourite romance books of all time, and it will be in my top 10 favourite adult fantasy books of all time, and you cannot stop me from mentioning it, because I will continue to do so. I've already read this book multiple times. It's one of the few books in recent years that I've both read for the first time in the past few years and reread in the past few years. A lot of the books that I reread are typically books that I read quite a long time ago, so that's saying something. This one is, like I said, a fantasy romance. It's set in a high fantasy world and it's the most beautiful, respectful, consensual, healthy, non-toxic relationship I've ever come across in any romance book, whether it be fantasy or contemporary or historical. It's perfection. We follow Ildiko and Brishan, which my plants are actually named after. This is Brishan right here, as they are joined together by an arranged marriage between their two peoples. So Ildiko is a human woman and Brishan is a Kai male. They are different species, different races in this magical world that don't typically get married, but for the purpose of politics they have both been chosen by their families to marry one another. And they enter into it with the spirit of, I hope I can be friends with and get on with my partner even though I don't expect to fall in love with them. And that is very much how it starts. It starts as this respectful, supportive partnership and friendship that just grows into something more throughout the book in the most honest and realistic way. I absolutely adore it, and there is a bit of magical, fantastical drama woven in there, a bit of danger, but more than anything this is a book about two people and their relationship with one another, even if one of them is a magical creature. It's just perfection and I absolutely love the series. The penultimate book on this list is In the Vanishers Palace by Aliette de Bodard. So this is a really interesting combination of fantasy and sci-fi. I usually just refer to it as speculative because I feel like it's got sci-fi elements and fantastical elements. And that's something that I've actually found in quite a few of Aliette de Bodard's works. This one in particular though is a loose retelling of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale with a young woman who goes to live with a dragon in order to tutor the dragon's children. And the dragon is also a woman, so their romance, because I mean like I said it's sort of a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, is also a romance between two women, and we know how much I love that. I've already mentioned it multiple times in this video. So a speculative fantastical Beauty and the Beast retelling with dragons and a queer romance is literally checking all of my boxes. But beyond even those themes, it's a book that explores the long-term ramifications of colonialism. It is set in a post-colonial, post-apocalyptic world with these dragons and these humans coexisting, and like I said, the political and social ramifications of colonialism in years gone by. So it's very much a political commentary as well as a fantastical romance, which is kind of incredible and an amazing thing to accomplish in what is quite a short book, but Aliette de Bodard does it so well. I've mentioned this whenever I've mentioned this author before, but she is a beautiful writer. Her prose are lyrical and I absolutely adore this story. Last but not least, however, is actually the book to most recently make it onto this list. It's the one that I've read the most recently. Only in the past couple of months did I pick this up, and that is Trick, book one in the Foolish Kingdoms series by Natalia Jaster. I keep wanting to call this one fantasy, and I don't know if there are more fantastical elements in the later books, but there's not really any fantasy in book one. It's just set in an alternative, somewhat medieval-esque kingdom world divided into 4 realms: summer, autumn, spring and winter, which gives me those magical kingdom vibes, but there's no real like magic in book one, if that makes sense. With or without magic, however, this book has a lot to offer. Like I mentioned, it's set in this world of 4 kingdoms, and it is taking place at one of their annual sort of get-togethers in which they make political unions and keep their kingdoms stable and make sure that they're all sort of gelling, you know, like healthy kingdom relationships. And we follow the Autumn Princess, who is there with her mother. She's yet to take over as queen, so she's sort of tagging along for the adventure. And she ends up having a bit of a run-in with the Spring Court Jester. So our Jester character, Poet, is both our love interest and sometimes our antagonist, but their relationship grows throughout the book. And as they learn one another's secrets, they become more and more drawn to one another, and Jester has a massive secret. Obviously, I cannot tell you what that secret is, but if you once again love a little bit of witty banter, flirtatious banter, a little bit of teasing, but also a relationship founded on mutual respect, then this is one that you're going to very much enjoy. I will note, however, that this is set in a world that effectively enslaves those who have learning disabilities, and for that that reason it can obviously be very difficult and harrowing to read in moments and maybe triggering for some, but the overarching plot of the series as a whole, which I'm yet to continue on with, is fighting this oppression and ending this oppression in this world, and that is sort of like the main political crux of the story, with these romances happening in tandem, and each book I believe has a different romance and a different couple in a different court and a different kingdom. So those are my top 10 favourite self-published books as of now. Obviously I plan on reading a lot more in the future, so this may change, but these are all fantastic books that I would highly recommend, and that is not something that's about to change, so definitely go check them out. I'll have them linked in the description box down below. But of course I'd love to hear what your favourite self-published books are, whether you have a favourite self-published author, a favourite self-published genre. What do you look for in your self-published books, and what would you recommend to me based on what I recommended to you? But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!